You bought a house? Just like that? My husband stammered, his voice shaking with disbelief. Why would you do something like that without even telling us? My mother-in-law tilted her head, feigning innocence. Why? Isn't it obvious? She said with a smug smile, her gaze daring us to question her further. Your wife has inherited a fortune. It's only natural for a daughter-in-law to support her mother-in-law. I froze, left speechless by her audacity. My husband looked at me, his face pale with shock. Willow, she continued, her tone now sharp, you've done almost nothing for me so far. This is the least you can do. It's time you fulfilled your duty. My name is Willow, and I'm 32 years old. I'm a homemaker, living with my husband, Jacob, a kind and caring man I first met during our university days. We clicked almost instantly, bonding over a shared love for photography and late-night coffee runs. Back then, our friends often called us the perfect couple, and honestly, it felt like we were. Growing up, I was incredibly close to my grandfather. He was my rock, someone I could always rely on for advice or just a warm hug. When I introduced Jacob, my fiancé at the time, to my family before our wedding, my grandfather initially observed him with a sharp, serious gaze. I could feel the tension in the air, but Jacob didn't falter. When he sincerely expressed just how much he loved me, my grandfather's face softened, and his signature warm smile returned. If it's you, I can trust her with you, he said, resting a hand on Jacob's shoulder. That moment meant the world to me. It was like the two most important men in my life had finally connected. Even after we got married, Jacob and I made it a point to visit my grandfather regularly. Over time, their bond grew deeper, and my grandfather became an irreplaceable figure in both of our lives. Every year, my husband and I would team up to pick out the perfect birthday gift for him. He joined us for holidays, dinners, and countless little celebrations, always bringing his special warmth to every occasion. He had a natural way of making people feel seen and valued. Jacob and I weren't immune to his charm. He truly became the heart of our little family. Of course, like any couple, my husband and I had our share of disagreements. Whether it was something small like whose turn it was to take out the trash or something bigger, my grandfather often acted as our mediator. With his calm wisdom, he would help us see each other's perspectives, smoothing over any rough patches. I genuinely believe that a big part of why our marriage has been so strong is thanks to his guidance and support. But life wasn't without its challenges. My mother-in-law, Melody, had always been a thorn in my side. From the very beginning, she seemed to find fault in everything I did. Her criticism was relentless. Willow, didn't you clean properly? There's still dust on that shelf. Willow, this dish isn't seasoned right. Jacob won't like it. You should redo it. Willow, you're always visiting your grandfather but never come to our house. Don't you understand your duties as a daughter-in-law? Every interaction with her felt like walking on eggshells. Eventually, I stopped going to my in-laws' house altogether, thinking that distance might bring me some peace. But Melody was persistent. She would sometimes show up at our house unannounced, making it impossible to truly escape her sharp tongue. At first, I hesitated to tell Jacob about how much his mother's behavior was affecting me. I didn't want to seem like I was complaining or trying to come between them. But one day, after an especially hurtful comment from her, I finally broke down and told him everything. To my surprise, Jacob didn't just listen. He was furious. "Mom, stop it," he said firmly the next time she criticized me. "Quit saying hurtful things to Willow. She works so hard every day to make our home happy. And housework isn't just her responsibility. If something isn't done, it's because I should be helping more. It's unfair to blame her for everything." Hearing him stand up for me like that made my heart swell with gratitude. Melody would apologize in the moment, caught off guard by her son's directness, but her behavior never really changed. No matter how many times Jacob confronted her, she found new ways to criticize me. Whenever I told him about her latest comments, he would sigh heavily, his frustration evident. I started to feel guilty about burdening him with the same problems over and over again. For a while, I even considered just keeping it all to myself. But my husband wouldn't hear of it. "Don't keep this from me," he insisted. "We'll handle it together." Together, we constantly worked on finding ways to encourage my mother-in-law to change and build a healthier relationship with her. It was a challenge we tackled as a team, always striving for a solution. A few days later, while checking the mailbox, I came across an envelope without a return address. Jacob was at work, so I opened it alone. What I found inside left me stunned. On plain white paper, someone had written cruel, hateful words in red ink. It was clearly directed at me. Phrases like heartless, worthless woman, and get out of here. The insults grew worse as I read, and I couldn't bring myself to finish. Shaking and overwhelmed, I tucked the letter away and immediately called my husband. The moment he answered, I broke down, sobbing so hard I could barely get the words out. Sensing how distressed I was, Jacob left work early and rushed home. When he read the letter, his face darkened with anger. Without a word, he crumpled it up and threw it away. But that wasn't the end of it. More letters followed, each more hateful than the last. What did I do to deserve this? I wondered aloud as despair took hold of me. My mental health spiraled, but Jacob stayed by my side, doing everything he could to support me. After a few days, my husband noticed something strange. The letters had no postmarks. Whoever was sending them wasn't mailing them, but placing them directly in our mailbox. Determined to get to the bottom of it, he set up a security camera. When we finally checked the footage, the truth left us speechless. It was my mother-in-law. Jacob confronted Melody immediately. "How could you do this? Think about how Willow feels," he demanded, anger and disappointment clear in his voice. But his mother was unapologetic. "It's her fault," she spat. "She stole my son from me." Her words cut deep, but by that point, I was so drained that I couldn't even respond. I just stood there in silence, completely spent. After Melody left, Jacob spent hours comforting me, but I couldn't seem to recover. Seeing how broken I was, my husband decided to take me to my grandfather's house, even though he was swamped with work. When my grandfather learned what had happened, he was furious, but more than anything, he was worried about me. "It's going to be okay," he said gently, over and over. "You have a wonderful husband who's always there for you. Keep leaning on him." Hearing my grandfather's steady, reassuring words slowly gave me the strength to move forward. Together, Jacob and I decided it was best to distance ourselves from Melody, and I stopped visiting my in-laws entirely. My husband never blamed me for that. In fact, he told me it was the right thing to do. Life became peaceful again, at least for a little while. But then, just as I was beginning to regain my emotional stability, devastating news arrived. My grandfather had passed away. The moment I heard, I crumbled into tears. When I looked up, I saw Jacob quietly wiping his own eyes, trying to hold back his grief. At the funeral, it was clear how deeply my grandfather had touched people's lives. So many mourned his loss, and some seemed utterly heartbroken, as though the light had gone out of their world. Even in his casket, he looked so serene that I half expected him to wake up at any moment. Flowers filled the room, each one a testament to how much he was loved and respected. As I said my final goodbye, I was overwhelmed by how much I had relied on him and how little I had been able to give back. Yet, until his very last moments, he had always been on my side, always offering his unwavering love and support. Knowing that gave me some comfort. I could only hope that now, after a lifetime of caring for others, he could finally rest in peace. In the days following my grandfather's funeral, Jacob and I were consumed by grief. Still, we knew my grandfather wouldn't have wanted us to dwell in sadness forever, so we slowly began to ease back into our daily routine. Then, out of the blue, I got a call from the last person I wanted to hear from, my mother-in-law, Melody. I hesitated, debating whether to answer. Ignoring her wasn't an option, though. Knowing her, she might escalate things as she had in the past. Reluctantly, I picked up. Melody's tone was unusually direct. She wanted Jacob and me to visit her soon, saying she had something important to show us. Despite my reservations, we agreed on a day. My husband was concerned about how I'd handle being around her, but I reassured him that as long as he was with me, she wouldn't try anything outrageous. I couldn't have been more wrong. When the day arrived, Melody greeted us with an air of smug excitement. She led us to a brand new house, a two-family home with separate entrances, clearly designed for two households to live independently. At first I was confused about why she was showing us this place, but then she delivered the shocking news. "This has been my dream for so long, to own a two-family home, she said with a satisfied smile. I bought it outright, all in one lump sum. Now you two can take over the payments from here on out. I felt the air leave my lungs. Jacob and I stared at her in disbelief. You bought a house? Just like that? My husband managed to ask, his voice shaking with confusion. Why would you do something like this without even telling us? My mother-in-law tilted her head, her expression one of exaggerated innocence. Why? Isn't it obvious? Willow's grandfather just passed away. She must have inherited a fortune from him. He lived in that big, beautiful house, didn't he? It's only natural for a daughter-in-law to support her mother-in-law. Willow, you've barely done anything for me so far. This is the least you can do. It's time you fulfilled your duty. Her audacity left me stunned. My heart raced as anger and disbelief surged through me. Jacob, standing beside me, looked just as shocked, his jaw tightening. We were still grieving my grandfather's loss, and yet here she was, shamelessly making demands, as if my life revolved around her needs. She had no concern for our feelings or the timing of her outrageous request. In that moment, I realized there was no reasoning with someone so self-centered. I didn't inherit anything, I said firmly, my voice steady, despite the anger bubbling inside me. Melody blinked, her smugness fading into confusion, then swiftly turning to rage. That's impossible. He must have left you something. Don't tell me you're refusing to help your own mother-in-law. What kind of heartless person are you? She spat, her voice rising with every word. She paused for effect, then delivered her next blow with exaggerated pity. My poor son, stuck with someone like you. You're useless. You should just get a divorce. Her words were venomous, but strangely, I wasn't afraid anymore. I met her gaze and calmly explained the truth. I'm not a legal heir to my grandfather, I began. Even if he had written a will, I wouldn't have taken anything. My mother offered to let me accept part of the inheritance because she was worried about me, but I declined. I realized I had relied on my grandfather my entire life without ever giving back to him. Taking his money wouldn't have felt right. So no, Melody, I didn't inherit anything. The color drained from her face as the reality of my words hit her. She had already bought the house outright, assuming she could use my inheritance to pay for it. But she had no money of her own. She'd been a homemaker her entire life. And my father-in-law was retired. We soon learned that she had taken out a massive loan from a finance company without consulting anyone, fully expecting that I would cover her debts. The fallout was catastrophic. When my father-in-law discovered what she'd done, he was livid. He couldn't forgive her recklessness and decided to leave her. Melody, now over 60, found herself alone, drowning in debt, and with no support system to fall back on. A part of me felt a flicker of pity for her. Her situation was undeniably grim, but it was hard to overlook the fact that her arrogance, entitlement, and disregard for others had brought her here. She had no one to blame but herself. After being abandoned by my father-in-law, Melody turned to my husband as her last hope, desperate for help. I overheard their conversation, and her desperation was impossible to miss. Please, Jacob, you have to help me. I can't live like this. You're my only hope. Don't you feel any responsibility for your own mother? I'm sorry for everything I've done. Let's move past it. Please, let's be a family again. Her voice was shaky, and she kept repeating her pleas, trying to sound remorseful. But Jacob, having endured years of watching her mistreat me, remained resolute. I'm sorry, but I can't help you. And please don't call us again, he said, his tone calm but final. He hung up, and without hesitation, deleted her number from his phone. I asked him gently, "Are you sure about this?" He gave me a small, reassuring smile. She's only facing the consequences of everything she's done. Honestly, I feel relieved. We don't owe her anything, my husband concluded. And so my mother-in-law was left completely alone, abandoned by both her husband and her son, burdened by the enormous debt she had recklessly accumulated. The two-family house she had purchased outright with a lump sum was now her sole responsibility. Unable to handle the financial strain, she had no choice but to sell the house. However, since she had already taken possession, she couldn't sell it for the original purchase price. This left her with a significant amount of unpaid debt, With no savings and no support, she couldn't even afford to rent a small apartment. In desperation, she took a job at a factory that provided employee housing. For someone like Melody, who had spent her entire married life as a homemaker, the demands of factory work were overwhelming. From what we heard, her boss was strict and unforgiving, and my mother-in-law wasn't allowed a moment to rest. She was constantly scolded for her mistakes, often reduced to tears during her shifts. At her age, her body couldn't keep up for long. One day, she collapsed from exhaustion and was taken to the hospital. Both Jacob and my father-in-law were contacted, but they refused to get involved. My husband told the hospital staff, "We are not her family," and my father-in-law gave a similar response. Without enough money for proper treatment, Melody was discharged before fully recovering and forced to return to the factory. Soon after, we began receiving letters from her, begging for help. She wrote page after page, pleading for our forgiveness and support, but Jacob and I wanted nothing to do with her. We returned the letters to the post office, refusing delivery. We had no interest in hearing from her again. When my mother-in-law turned to her extended family for help, they too refused. Most of them had already grown tired of her selfishness, and her constant pleas for money only cemented their decision to cut ties. In the end, even her closest relatives shut her out completely. Despite everything, she remained as self-centered as ever. I couldn't forget her cruel remarks about my grandfather's passing, or the years of harassment she inflicted on me. She never showed any real remorse, and her attempts to exploit my grandfather's death for personal gain left me with no sympathy for her. I believe old age should bring peace, but for someone like my mother-in-law, I can only hope she's haunted by the consequences of her actions. Happiness is something she denied others, so she doesn't deserve it for herself. When things finally settled down, Jacob and I visited my grandfather's grave. My mother had been visiting regularly and taking care of the site. The area was pristine. The headstone gleamed in the sunlight, and fresh flowers adorned the grave. We brought his favorite blooms, lit incense, and stood side by side in silent prayer. In that quiet moment, we spoke to him in our hearts, thanking him for everything he had done for us. Though he's no longer with us, my grandfather's love and wisdom continue to guide us. He saved us time and time again in ways I'll never forget, and his memory will forever remain a part of our lives. Moving forward, I want to live in a way that reflects his kindness and strength. I want my choices to honor the lessons he taught me, ensuring that, even though he's no longer here, I live a life he would have been proud of.